The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by MassMutual. It is one of the most coveted trophies in the world, but are gold medals really gold? Well, mostly, they're not. The gold medals given out these days are nearly entirely silver and are plated with pure gold to give them that iconic sheen. Silver medals are, of course, made with silver, and bronze medals are a combination of copper and other metals like tin or zinc. And while winning an Olympic medal is priceless, the value of the materials in the medal are not. In recent games, some of the materials used to make the medals have come from recycled cell phones. MassMutual celebrates women's sports history and understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a MassMutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
The Athletic.
Hello and welcome to And Colossally, That's History, the podcast that takes an unadulterated look at the earth-shattering events, epic sagas and huge characters that have shaped motor racing history. I'm Richard Williams and I'm joined as ever by my old friend and co-host Matt Bishop. Matt, how are you doing? Are you ready for another trip back in time?
I'm very well, thanks, Richard. And how are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
That makes two of us. So yes, I'm very much looking forward to this next episode. And I'm especially excited about this episode because we're not just revisiting the past, as we always do, but also we're going to be doing some ranking, some 1 to 5 ranking, which is always fun.
That's right. On today's episode, we're going to be ranking the top 5 British drivers to have raced for Ferrari. And the listeners can probably guess why we're doing this topic.
Exactly so. And I don't know when you're going to be listening to this exactly, but we're recording it in mid-March 2024. And not only has the hysteria surrounding Lewis Hamilton's move, or mooted, or immediate, no, not mooted, but imminent, definite move from Mercedes to Ferrari for 2025 barely subsided, but we've also seen another British driver, Ollie Bearman, make his F1 debut with Ferrari at age 18, by the way. And what a fabulous debut it was too. Points first time out. So we thought, what better time to look back on the other British drivers who have raced for Ferrari in Formula One. And there's actually been quite a few of them, Richard, hasn't there?
There have been. And we make it 12, Ollie Bearman being the 12th and youngest, and the youngest driver ever to make his debut in a Ferrari in a Grand Prix.
And the youngest Brit ever to make his debut in a Championship Grand Prix as well.
Yes, indeed. And that dozen includes 2 world champions and 3 who made only 1 start apiece.
Absolutely right. But anyway, as a biographer of Enzo Ferrari, and that is you, Richard, do you have a feeling for why he liked British drivers quite so much? Or on the team's front, it's rather surprising because the Brits were always his arch enemies going back all the way through the 50s and onwards.
Well, I think his relationship with British motor racing really began in the very early 50s when Tony van der Velde, the maker of thin wall bearings and later of van wall racing cars, sold him some bearings for Ferrari engines and bought a Ferrari, which he renamed the Thin Wall Special and got various people to drive, up-and-coming and more experienced drivers. And Enzo Ferrari and Tony van der Velde had a pretty good relationship, I think. And through that, I think Enzo began to look at British drivers a bit more closely. And the first one he looked at very seriously. It didn't come to anything. That was Stirling Moss. But then there was Mike Hawthorn, and Hawthorn, won an important race for him in 1953. And then, then there were Peter Collins and then John Surtees and various others all the way through the dozen we're going to talk about.
Interesting. The Thin Wall Special, fantastic car, actually, wasn't it?
Beautiful car.
Beautiful car.
Green Ferrari.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah.
Why, this is a slight aside, but why was Van Wall called Van Wall, not Van der Velde?
I suppose because it was a conflation of Van der Velde and Thinwall. And Thinwall isn't a wonderful name for a racing car, is it really? Van Wall's a bit better. I know when I was, 10 or 11, Van Wall was a great name. It seemed terrifically charismatic, as did the cars.
Yes, well, and wonderful cars, although Stirling Moss always said they handled badly.
Yep.
He still won plenty of races in them, but he said they handled badly. Anyway, yes, you mentioned Mike Hawthorne's famous win. You're thinking about the race of the century at Reims?
I am, 1953 at Reims, when he fought it out with Juan Manuel Fangio, who was in a Maserati, up the finishing straight on the last lap and just got ahead.
And swapping the lead all the way through,
yes,
endlessly.
Yeah. And with Gonzalez close behind as well. So it was a wonderful race.
It was a wonderful race, the race of the century. There's probably a few rivals to it ever since, but that was maybe the first Formula One race of the century. You mentioned Moss, Stirling Moss. He never drove for Ferrari, but how close did he come, and what do you think would have happened if he had done?
Twice he came very close indeed. The first time was in 1951 at Bari in Puglia, down the east coast of Italy, when they had a non-championship Formula One race. And Enzo Ferrari invited Moss to go down and drive one of his cars in this non-championship race. The year before in Bari, Moss had come second in an HWM and impressed everybody because that was a Formula 2 car, and he'd come second to Fangio in one of the great Alfettas, which was quite an achievement. So that had marked Enzo's card, and he invited Moss down, and Moss travelled from London with his dad. They drove down, I think, to through Europe, across the Alps, down Italy to Bari. Not an inconsiderable journey in 1951, in the days before Autostrada and so on. And they got there, and they found the paddock. It was a street circuit in Bari. They found where the Ferrari team had set up their garage, and there were the cars. And Moss knew he was. I think they had a 625, which was a Formula One car, and a 500, which was a Formula 2 car at the time. And Moss knew he'd be driving the 500, so he went over to it and said to the mechanics, "Can I try it?" And the mechanic said, "Well, what are you doing here? This isn't your car. This is Taruffi's car." And they shooed him away. And it turned out there wasn't a car for him. So he was very upset. And having gone all that way, and he and his father made a vow at that point never to drive for Ferrari. That Stirling would never drive for Ferrari. So he took delight in later years in beating the Ferraris with Maseratis and Van Walls and Coopers and Lotuses. But then at the end of 1961, when he was driving brilliantly, in that year he'd produced 2 masterpieces in a Lotus at Monaco and Nürburgring to win the race against the much faster Ferraris. But he was a bit fed up of being an underdog, mechanically speaking, the whole time. So he had a meeting with Ferrari in Maranello, at which they made an agreement that he would drive a Ferrari in 1962. It would be painted in the colours of Rob Walker, who'd been entering his Lotuses and Coopers. Rob Walker, the heir to the Johnny Walker whiskey fortune. And Rob's cars, being Scottish, they were painted dark blue with a white band on the nose, like the Scottish flag. So that was what apparently was going to happen. The Ferraris in 1961 had been fantastic cars. Phil Hill had been the world champion and so on. So it looked like Moss was finally going to get into a car that would win him the world championship. And he was going to drive the GTO car as well in long-distance races. But then at Easter Monday, start of the 1962 season, he had his terrible accident and took a long time to recover from dreadful injuries, and came back, tried out a car at Goodwood and decided he was going to retire. So never drove a works Ferrari, which actually was probably not such a terrible thing, because having been all-conquering in 1961, the 1962 Ferrari was an absolute dog compared with the developments that Lotus and Cooper had made. So it might not have ended happily.
He might have stuck around till 1964, and then he would have been probably won Surtees championship. Perhaps.
Yes, that may be true. Whether he would have stayed that long, who knows? Moss didn't tend to stay anywhere very long, so he might have switched teams again. But that's in the realms of speculation.
Totally. Anyway, the long, the short of it is Moss did not race for Ferrari, as mooted twice with a 10 years apart. 51 and 61. And I did like your description of when he went down to Bari and was second in an HWM Formula 2 car, beaten by an Alfetta. And just compare the names. It's such an emblem of the decade to come. England or UK versus Ferrari. Alfetta versus Hersham and Walton Motors. Anyway. I think that's some good scene setting. And I suppose I should explain how this episode will work. Richard and I have each ranked our top Ferrari drivers, British Ferrari drivers, and our lists have then been combined by our producer, Johnny, thank you, Johnny, to form our combined ultimate top 5 Brits in Ferrari's ranking. So we're going to go through that list from number 5 to number 1. But before we do, Richard, how did you approach the task, and did you find it difficult?
Well, it's very difficult, isn't it? It's comparing across eras is always fun, but never easy and never really definitive. I gave priority to drivers who won the World Championship for Ferrari, because that's what they're there to do, and if they do that, they've done their job. And I think that's what the team would have thought too. But then also drivers who made distinctive contributions, whether it was the one who won the first Grand Prix after the death of Enzo Ferrari, which was obviously a very big morale-boosting thing. And that was Nigel Mansell, but we'll come to that later. So that kind of thing weighed a bit with me too. Of course, there's sheer speed, but there's also a question of being able to integrate within the team, coping with the politics that have always been such a wonderful part of the Ferrari scene. Where would Formula One be without Ferrari politics? And the drivers have to deal with that. So that was a factor too.
Then and now, Ferrari, primus inter pares, first amongst equals, in Formula One, much to the chagrin of Ron Dennis, with whom I used to work at McLaren, but nonetheless the case. And Ferrari still, then and now, offered, advantages and guarantees and financial special treatments, because in one sense, Ferrari is the only brand, really, to use a word that wouldn't have been used in the time, that is bigger than Formula One itself, you could argue.
Yeah.
Whereas obviously, there are some other great brands, Aston Martin, McLaren, Mercedes-Benz, not necessarily in a racing context bigger than Formula One itself, but Ferrari perhaps is. So anyway, I approached ranking the top 5 in I think a slightly less, maybe a little bit more emotional at times, because on the one hand, I did try to incorporate and bear in mind all the factors you've said, but the person I chose as number 1, we can come to that later, I chose simply because I thought he was one of the most underrated, brilliant drivers that there's ever been. But we'll come to that later. So before we get to discussing our top 5, our combined top 5, shall we talk just briefly, about some of the drivers who missed the top 5 cut?
Yes, and the first driver I wanted to talk about was a man called Mike Parks, who some of our listeners will have heard of, who arrived at Ferrari in 1963 as an engineer. He was the son of the chairman of Alvis Cars, and he'd done an apprenticeship in engineering at Roots, the Roots Group, which was Sunbeam and Hillman. And
he worked on the Hillman Imp, I believe.
I think he did, yeah. Yeah, he did. And then he joined Ferrari as an engineer and did some sports car racing. That was a time when John Surtees was in the team, and we'll talk about Surtees a bit later. And having two English, Surtees fancied himself as an engineer always. He always thought he could improve the cars, and quite a lot of the time he could. But he and Parks locked horns. So it wasn't really until Surtees left the team, having won the World Championship. He won the World Championship in 1964, but then left in 1966 after a row. Which Parks may or may not have had something to do with, that Parks got his chance in the Formula One team. He only had half a dozen starts in works Ferraris, but he did come second at Reims in 1966 and second at Monza behind his teammate Lodovico Scarfiotti, also in 1966. And then at the beginning of 1967, he won the international trophy at Silverstone in a Ferrari. And then I was present, actually, when his Grand Prix career ended at Spa. I was sitting above Eau Rouge at the top of the hill there. And if you saw across the valley on the other side of the circuit, I could see his car disintegrate when it left the track and hit a bank. And he had pretty bad injuries, and that was the end of his F1 career. Ferrari wouldn't let him back into a Grand Prix car again after that. And he went on and drove sports cars, and quite successfully. But then he was killed he was working for Lancia, and he was killed in a road crash some years later. But I think he was clearly a very talented driver. You know, his limited number of starts, you could see that he was really quick, and you could see from his sports car results. You know, he came second at Le Mans in 1967 with sharing a Ferrari with Scarfiotti. He was a really good driver.
I thought he was a really good driver. In fact, I ranked him number 6, so just the best of the rest outside our top 5. So very quick man. And I have to say, talking again about the mix of English and Italian, imagine having a lineup of Mike Parks and Ludovico Scarfiotti. How perfect. I also quite ranked reasonably highly Cliff Allison.
Yep.
Not because he had in any way a glorious Ferrari career. He didn't. Or indeed Lotus career. He didn't have a glorious one of those very early in the Lotus story. But he is still a driver who has raced for Lotus and Ferrari in Formula One, which not that many people, there's a list of them, of course, but he is one. And he was a lovely man. I met him towards the end of his life, and in fact received a letter from him, which he posted on the morning he died.
But he was 90 or something, wasn't he?
He wasn't quite that old. I think he was more like 80.
Was he?
But he drove. By that, he would fallen on hard times. He was driving the village bus in Bruff in Cumbria, where he lived. His business having not succeeded. Anyway,
wasn't that his father's garage, which ran the school bus around the villages there?
It was, but unfortunately they built a bypass, so the garage. That didn't help business. Anyway, we're not here to talk about Mike Parks or Cliff Allison, except en passant. So, is it now time to talk about number 5?
Certainly is. And that's Nigel Mansell. What was your view of Mansell, Matt?
Well, as a Ferrari driver, difficult to talk about Mansell only as a Ferrari driver because, of course, 31 Grand Prix victories, but 28 of them for Williams and only three for Ferrari. Nonetheless, in that time, he did become beloved of the tifosi, I think, and indeed they called him, or at least we British journalists supposed that they actually called him Il Leone. Perhaps they did.
They did. I remember seeing that a few times in headlines in the Gazzetta dello Sport. Definitely.
Well, so he did. He did win their hearts, and he did win the first race he ever did, or Formula One race he ever did for Ferrari, which was at Jacarapagua in Rio in 1989, Brazilian Grand Prix. And not many people have won a Grand Prix on their Ferrari debut, Fernando Alonso being one such. But yeah, he did. And at that point, I think I would have been very surprised if you told me he'd only ever win 2 more, since that was his 29th. No, it wasn't. Since he'd already won tons for Williams, and he would win tons more for Williams after that.
Of course, that win in Rio was significant in a couple of ways. One, it came just a few months after Enzo Ferrari had died, so the team's morale was in fact the company's morale as a whole was not good at that point. So to have a win was a great boost for the team, I think. And, they were going to go through, the team and the company were going to go through a difficult time, but that was a help. And that was in a car designed by John Barnard, who'd come up with the paddle gear shifts, semi-automatic gear change with paddle shifts. And that was the debut for that particular feature at Rio, and it won, of course. And now, you walk down the street and look in the windows of cars, and every 5th one probably will have paddle shifts, and that goes all the way back to that.
Absolutely, and it became de rigueur in Formula One very soon.
Very quickly it did, yeah.
And it wasn't only the death of Enzo Ferrari that the team, if you like, was reeling from, but also because the previous year it had been, humiliated by McLaren, which had won famously 15 out of 16 races, a horrible thing for Ferrari and a horrible thing for Enzo Ferrari. They did win 1 race at Monza. It was actually a 1-2, Gerhard Berger first and Michele Alboreto second. And I believe, yes, that race happened just after Enzo had died, which was also an absolute shot in the arm for the team. But nonetheless, McLaren then went back to winning the rest of the races that season, and then we went to Brazil, and no Enzo, the team reeling from having been beaten very soundly by McLaren, and Cesare Fiorio in charge, someone with whom Nigel Mansell didn't get on. His teammate, a very easy person to get on with at that time, Gerhard Berger, but the following year, of course, Nigel's second year at Ferrari, Alain Prost, I always regard as the ultimate terrible teammate to have, because very quick and also very political.
Yeah, and he was coming into what was already a very politically difficult team. So, clearly Prost had his priorities, which was to make it his own team. And make sure it wasn't Mansell's team anymore. And I think he worked pretty hard at that. And he won some races, and Nigel only won 1 more in Estoril in 1990.
He won 3 altogether.
3 altogether, yeah. He won, He won in Rio and Hungary in '89. And then in Estoril. But it was an unhappy season for him, I think, in every way. It was very disillusioning. He'd, even though the first season hadn't been easy, he'd won over the fans. He was feeling, he was someone who needed to feel happy and comfortable. But then along came the professor.
And I think the professor was also thinking, or the professeur was thinking, once bitten, twice shy. I've been Sennared, so I'm not going to be Manselled. Yeah. And he made sure he wasn't.
Yeah, and Mansell was never politically adroit on the same level, for sure.
As either Prost or Senna?
No.
Well, I think that might be a good time to come to a break, having dealt with Nigel Mansell, the 5th greatest Brit to have driven for Ferrari in Formula One, we think.
We do.
We love talking stats here at The Athletic. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cash Back Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right. You could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on, or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn, and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/credit card.
Okay, we're going to move on to driver number 4, who's a figure from the 1950s, and a very glamorous and charismatic one too. Peter Collins of Kidderminster, who joined the Ferrari team in 1956. What's your feeling about Collins, Matt?
Well, I think Collins, very quick, but, I actually put him at number 4, and he ended up at number 4. And look, as you say, dapper, handsome. Our mutual friend Nigel Roebuck used to say about Carlos Reutemann that he had the looks of a racing driver from Central Casting. I remember that phrase. Well, so did Peter Collins.
He certainly did, particularly for the 50s. He was a perfect 1950s figure.
And his beautiful girlfriend, then wife, Louise King,
Yep.
who was ever present.
American actress whom he met in Miami, set up by Sterling Moss, and married a week later. And they were blissfully happy for the short period of time that was granted to him.
The short period of time that was granted them, which we'll come to. And of course, he won 3 Grand Prix for Ferrari, 2 in 56, 1 in 58. And he was a quick man. And obviously one always lumps the two together with Hawthorn, but we'll come to Hawthorn. Let's talk a bit about the 1956 season, because, of course, it was a Fangio championship year, one of many, one of 5. But it's just possible that it could have been a Collins championship year, could it not?
Yes, it could. Ferrari had quite a lot of drivers in 1956. He had Fangio, he had Collins, he had the 2 young Italians, Eugenio Castellotti and Luigi Musso, whose chief priority was to beat each other, I think, to be the best Italian. And Ferrari, they were a fairly wild bunch, and he shuffled them around from race to race. And obviously, Fangio joined the team in 56 from Mercedes as world champion and established as the sort of patron of the drivers, and was expecting to win the world championship again, and that might even have been in his contract. So everything was done. Although Ferrari didn't like Fangio, didn't get on with him, but everything was done.
Was that too big for his boots or too grand?
No, it wasn't. No, I think he probably his manager asked for too much money that Ferrari didn't want to pay. That might have had something to do with it. And he always said he had a tinny little voice. I don't think he liked him on a personal level either.
He wanted a basso supremo.
Or a heroic tenor, maybe. Anyway, Fangio needed a bit of help to win the title in 1956. And in the end, he got it from Peter Collins, who was as they went to Monza for the last race of the season. And Collins was still in with a shout, and I think Moss was too, and Fangio. It was a very hot day. They were using the banked circuit as well as the road circuit, and it was chewing up the Ferrari's tyres. And there were lots of crashes, lots of punctures, high speed. Fangio's steering broke at one point, and his car crashed, and he got back to the pits and needed a new car. And the team manager of the time asked all the drivers, when they came into the pits, would you let Fangio take over your car? Because in those days, if there were 2 drivers in a car, they split the points. And if Fangio got half the points, then that would be enough to make him world champion. And Musso particularly refused. No, I'm not getting out. I'm an Italian racing in front of an Italian crowd at the Great Italian Circuit in an Italian car. So I'm not getting out for this Argentinian, even though he might be the world champion. So he carried on. And when Collins came in, Collins agreed, being an English gentleman, and got out. And Fangio got in. And Moss was going to win the race, but then ran out of petrol, and Fangio got enough points to win the championship, thanks to Collins.
Thanks to Collins. And you mentioned Musso. Obviously, Musso didn't like Hawthorn or Collins at all. And I think his widow, didn't she actually say, I think she did a quote saying, I hated them.
Yes, that was a couple of years later when Musso died at Reims, when he was trying to win the race. Which carried the greatest prize money. Reims, there was a much bigger prize pot at Reims.
And 100 bottles of champagne.
And 100 bottles of champagne, yeah, for pole position and for winning the race, yeah. I don't think he was so interested in the champagne. I think he needed the money, actually. He had a car dealership that was in a bit of trouble back home. And I think his girlfriend, Fiamma Bresci, felt when he was killed that Hawthorne and Collins, the Englishman, had ganged up against him. I don't think that was really true, actually, but I think in her understandably fevered imagination, that took hold. But anyway, we got a bit ahead of ourselves there, because Collins didn't win the World Championship that he might have won in 56.
But he did have a very, very good season in 56. In fact, I noted that in the 7 Grand Prix he raced there, it was DNF, did not finish, second, first, second, DNF, second.
Yes, well, that's in fact a much better year than Hawthorne had in 58 when he won the World Championship. Collins was very unlucky that year, and he was only, I think, 25 at the time. He would have, he should have had a long and glorious career. And, he and Moss should have been fighting it out for World Championships later on, no doubt about that. But then 57, was a good year for Maserati, where Fangio had gone. And then 58, Ferrari had a very good car again for Hawthorne, Collins and Musso for a while. But then Collins won it very convincingly at Silverstone, won the British Grand Prix in front of his home crowd, terrific victory. And it looked as though he was going to be one of the contenders for the title that year with Hawthorne and with Moss, who was in a Van Wall and winning races. But then at the Nürburgring, he and Hawthorne in the Ferraris were chasing Tony Brooks's Van Wall, I think. And Collins went wide at a corner and hit the bank, was thrown out, hit a tree and was killed. Very, very tragically indeed. And it was an awful time for Ferrari, because Musso had just been killed and they'd lost Castellotti the year before and so on. So it was, and Deportago as well the year before. It was a very dark time indeed for Ferrari.
A very dark time. And you mentioned, of course, Tony Brooks. And Tony Brooks is the driver that we have at number 3 of our top 5. I actually made him number 1.
Yeah, I had him at number 5, and there's a very specific reason for that. But you tell us why you think he should have been number 1.
I had him at number 1 simply because Sterling Moss said, and I saw it quoted, and I actually asked him, Sterling, if he would stand by this, which he did. He said, Hawthorne and Collins were very quick, but not a patch on Brooks. Brooks was the driver, the British driver that I saw. Obviously, he revered Fangio, but Brooks was the one that he thought was a foeman worthy of his steel, if you like. And, Brooks at Spa, the old Spa, was something to behold. I know he didn't have the career he should have had. The ex-dentist that only did 30-odd Grand Prix, but won a good proportion of them, 2 for Ferrari and quite a few more. Was it about a few?
2 for Ferrari and 4 for Van Wall.
Exactly.
Yep.
So 6 out of 30-odd,
Yep.
Very good strike rate. And, a beautifully fluent, fast, brave driver.
Yeah, he was very, very good on quick circuits. Quite interesting in 58 for Van Wall. He won at Spa, Aarhus, at the Great Speed Bowl in Berlin, and Monza, all very, very high-speed circuits. And then in 59, when he moved to Ferrari, after Van Wall's closed operations, he won at Reims again and Aarhus again. So once more, those fast circuits. So that's one of my 2 reservations about Brooks. The other being that although he loved road circuits, he didn't win on a street circuit. He didn't win on a really tight, slow, low-speed circuit, which is, one sign of a great driver, not the only one. But he was clearly a very fast, very polished performer. But my real reservation about him as a Ferrari driver came in his last race for Ferrari in 1959, when they went to Sebring for the second ever American Grand Prix on the old airfield circuit at Sebring. And there were 3 drivers in with a chance of the championship. He was one, Moss was another, and Brabham was the third. And it was a very complicated series of equations that, for each one to win the title at that race. Brooks certainly had to win, and Moss and Brabham had to come no higher than second or third, something like that. Anyway, it was complicated.
No lower.
No lower, that's right. Sorry. Yeah. He qualified third in the days when there was a 3-car front row, but then got bounced off to the second row when Harry Schell, at the end of practice, turned in a very quick time. It wasn't until some time later that it was discovered that Schell had actually cut off part of the circuit. He'd found a shortcut at this airfield, and he'd missed off the entire straight, cut his time by 6 seconds or something. Started from the front row, and I think he was 8th at the end of the first lap. But what happened on that first lap, it was very bad luck for Brooks, because on that first lap, he was rammed up the rear by his young German teammate, Wolfgang von Trips. And he could have carried on, but he'd promised his young wife, his lovely young Italian wife, that if there was any damage to his car, he would always have it checked. He'd had 2 really bad accidents, one in 56 in the British Grand Prix with a BRM, and one at Le Mans with an Aston, I think in 57, with cars that already were carrying some form of mechanical fault or damage. And he promised his wife that if that happened again, he would have it checked and he wouldn't race until he was satisfied with the car's integrity. So much to the irritation of the Ferrari team management, he came in at the end of that first lap to have the car checked over. It took 2 minutes to check it. He got back into the race and drove like a demon afterwards, but couldn't finish any higher than third, and so didn't win the championship, which was looked on with great disfavour back at Maranello.
I can imagine it certainly was, particularly by Enzo Ferrari himself. But it gave Jack Brabham his first world championship and the first rear-engined world championship.
It did, and Brabham won it by pushing the car over the line because he'd run out of petrol 400 yards from the finish.
Still,
those were the days.
Still rear-powered because...
Yeah, he wasn't pulling it.
No, he wasn't pulling it. Anyway, I as I say, look, I'm happy with Tony Brooks ending up at number 3. I made him number 1 simply because of his extraordinary prowess. As you say, the old Spa, Nürburgring Monza, fast circuits, Reims, and because of what Sterling Moss said. But actually as a Ferrari driver, rather than taking his career in the hole, I'm very happy with number 3.
Very good. And now it's time for another ad break. So we'll be back in a moment to discuss who we ranked at number 2 on our list and who has claimed the title of Ferrari's best British driver.
So we're now down to the final 2, number 1 and number 2. So who is number 2? Well, I'll tell you who number 2 is. It's Mike Hawthorn. Mike Hawthorn, the other half of Mon Ami Mate, and obviously won a world championship for Ferrari in 1958, won only 3 Grand Prix for Ferrari, though, in 53, 54 and 58. But we can talk a lot about Mike Hawthorn, green jacket, bow tie, looked 50 when he was 26.
Never seen without a pint of beer in his hand.
Frothing ale.
Yeah, flat cap.
All of that.
Yes. Born in Mexborough in Yorkshire in 1929, brought up in Farnham in Surrey, where his father, Leslie, who was a motorcycle racer, I think, had a garage.
And where a very distant relation of mine worked with him on his early cars, not Ferraris, but before he...
The Cooper Bristol,
yes,
Rileys.
Cooper Bristols and the old Riley.
Yeah.
Yes, Hugh Sewell in our family, and he was married to my grandmother's first cousin. Actually, she married 3 times. But anyway, so one of them was Huey Sewell. And Huey Sewell does get mentioned in Mike Hawthorn's 2 books, which I think are quite good books.
They are good, yeah. Challenge Me, The Race and Champion Year.
Precisely so.
Highly recommended.
Highly recommended.
If you can find them.
Anyway, there he was, frothing ale, green jackets, bow ties, looked old, actually quite quick.
Yeah, very quick. I mean, he made an impression. His dad bought him a Cooper Bristol in the early 50s. And in the 1952 British Grand Prix, which was run at a time when the World Championship was run for 2-litre Formula 2 cars, he came third, which was pretty impressive in a field of very hot Ferraris and Maseratis. And I think that made an impression on Ferrari, certainly, because he was in the Ferrari team for the next year in 1953, when he won that marvellous race at Reims, that epic finish, beating Fangio and Gonzalez by a whisker at the end of a really torrid contest. And that actually, another element of that result was that it ended Alberto Ascari's streak of 9 wins in a row for Ferrari. But it continued the run for Ferrari because that's who Hawthorne was driving for. But it prevented Maserati from snapping that streak, at least. And it was a big thing.
Of course, in those years, it was the Formula One World Championship, but Formula 2 cars.
Yeah.
Formula 2 cars, yeah.
2-litre cars. And Hawthorne did have a fantastic season. He finished every race. He was second 3 times, third 4 times, and he was 5th and 6th. So, never out of the points. It was a terrific performance. And in a very good Ferrari, the 500, which had taken Ascari to 2 championships in a row. Following season, he wasn't so lucky because they came up with the Squallow and the Super Squallow, which was not exactly super. He did win a race in Spain at Pedralbes in Barcelona, but that was the end of that run. And I think at that point he decided he wanted to spend more time at home and driving British cars.
In the pubs of Surrey.
In the pubs of Surrey, yes.
And he did do that, and he raced for Van Wall and
BRM. I think.
BRM.
Yeah.
And but then he did return. We're talking about Ferrari. Of course, he did then return to Ferrari. Well, how did that come about, Richard?
Well, Collins might have had something to do with it, I would have thought. As you mentioned the Mon Ami mate thing earlier. They were pals. They went around together. They did the things that young men do together when they've got a bit of money and scope for enjoying themselves. Mon Ami mate came about. It was a line in a cartoon, a bubble in a cartoon, where this character referred to a friend of his as Mon Ami mate, and they picked that up and they used it about each other, and it became the title of a very good joint biography of the two by the late Chris Nixon. Mon Ami Mate, a very highly recommended book. Again.
Very highly recommended, if you can find it.
If you can find it, like a lot of these books. But it is really good. And so Hawthorne was back in a Ferrari for 58 with Collins and Luigi Musso, and a very good car, the Dino 246, lighter, quicker, very, very handy little car indeed. A bit more agile than the Van Wall, which was being driven by Moss and Brooks and Stuart Lewis Evans, which was not an agile car, but was very quick. Anyway, they were well matched. But Hawthorne won only 1 race that season at Reims again, whereas Moss won 3, and I think Brooks won 3, but Hawthorne racked up the points. Collins was killed, Musso was killed during the season.
Lewis Evans was killed at the end.
Lewis Evans was killed at the end, although not in contention for the championship. But, by the end, when they went to Casablanca for the last race of the season, it was between Moss and Hawthorne. And Moss did everything he needed, everything he could do. He won the race and he got a point for the fastest lap in the time when that's when you got a point for that. And he needed Hawthorne to do no better than coming third. And that nearly happened. In second place was Hawthorne's young, new Ferrari teammate, Phil Hill, who did the decent thing and number 2 should do and let Hawthorne by. And that won Hawthorne the title, having won only 1 race in the year. and having been given back some points a little early, a couple of races earlier, by Moss's chivalry, when the stewards in Portugal, the stewards tried to disqualify Hawthorn, but Moss spoke on his behalf at the tribunal immediately after the race and got his points reinstated, and that was also enough to win Hawthorn the title.
So we've had an act of chivalry from Peter Collins and another one just now described by you by Stirling Moss. I think of all the championships that Stirling Moss did not win, because he came third a bunch of times and second a bunch of times, 58 is the one he really should have won, and kind of, with respect to Mike Hawthorn, I always kind of almost see it as his year, what really should have been his championship year.
Yes, it showed the number of wins and his general superiority, but that's Moss for you. He didn't win. And then poor Hawthorn, having won his title, retired to consternation back at Maranello. He retired very soon after that last race, and Ferrari were not expecting it at all. They thought they would have the world champion going with them going into the next season.
Well, he had a kidney disease, didn't he?
He did, and it was debilitating, and it had been for some years. He had off days, and when he had an off day, it was usually because of that. So I think that was a big factor. And he'd lost his best mate, Collins as well. I think that was another factor. And they had a garage business that, he was going to look after. But then, unhappily, a few weeks after the end of the season, he was driving his Jaguar Mark II to a meeting in London, came out onto the A3.
Was he not racing Rob Walker?
Yeah, well, he came out onto the A3, and Rob Walker was also on his way to London in his Gullwing Mercedes 300 SL. And Hawthorn, this was 1959. Hawthorn didn't like the idea of being beaten by a German car in any environment at all. So it's pretty clear that they had a bit of a dice going down the hill of the Guildford bypass. And it was it had been raining a bit, so the road was wet. He went off in the Jaguar, hit a tree and killed himself, which was an awful end to his world championship.
An absolutely awful end. But anyway, that's our number 2 driver, and I'm sure quite a few people must have worked out who our number 1 driver is. And in fact, I didn't make him number 1, but I ranked him highly. But you did make him number 1, Richard. Why?
Well,
we're talking about John Surtees, by the way. We're talking about John Surtees.
Yeah, Surtees did 2 things that make him, to my mind, an outstanding Ferrari driver. One, he came in and helped the team recover from a very difficult situation that it was in through his enthusiasm, his ability, and to some extent his engineering knowledge. But then, having won the World Championship, he left the team in acrimony after an enormous amount of politicking. And that's another, mark of distinction for a Ferrari driver, in my view. He had 30 Grand Prix in a Ferrari and he won 4 of them. And that was enough to win the title.
And 4 non-championship races as well.
He did. That's absolutely true. Yeah, which had some significance in those days.
They did. And I love the little list, because just imagine how glamorous these 4 non-championship races that he won for Ferrari must have been. Kyle Army. Yeah. Whatever your views of apartheid, early 60s, going to Kyle Army must have been the most extraordinary, glamorous thing to do. And then Pergusa and Syracuse twice.
Yeah.
There we are. That's a Ferrari tally, isn't it, really?
Yeah. Yeah. I went to Syracuse once.
Did you?
And went looking for the old circuit. And it was on the outskirts of a beautiful town. And there was policeman hanging around. So I said, can you tell me where the old circuit went, where the start and finish and where the pits were? And he pointed down the road. And I said, I'll just take a stroll down. He said, that's where the sex workers are. He didn't use that term, but that was the burden of what he was saying. So I didn't, in fact.
So
go any further,
you did
but
not, even on the basis of important research for your books.
That's, I'm afraid, that's where I drew the line in terms of research. But that was a fabulous race, Syracuse Grand Prix. Never a championship race.
Never.
But it was always really interesting.
Well, he won it. Surtees won it twice for Ferrari. And, of course, he won a championship Ferrari as 1964, as you say.
Yeah.
And it is worth just saying, he was a magnificent motorsport exponent. I'm going to say driver and rider.
The only man ever to win the World Championship on 2 wheels and on 4 wheels. Nobody
Absolutely. And he won Grand Prix not only for Ferrari, but also for Cooper and Honda.
Yep.
And he was something of an engineer driver.
He was.
He was.
And he came into Ferrari for the 1963 season when they'd had just an absolute disaster in 1962. There'd been a big row at the end of the brilliant 1961 season when some of the engineers and senior managers complained that Ferrari's wife had been interfering too much, that she'd been, hanging around checking their invoices and, what payments had been made and making suggestions which were not exactly helpful. And Ferrari sacked them and then tried to unsack them, but couldn't. They all stayed out. And there were some very senior people like Carlo Chiti, the chief designer, for instance. So Ferrari had to promote a lot of people who, probably weren't ready. And 62 was a disaster, complete disaster. It was a terrible car, terrible morale. But then they got Surtees in. And now Surtees was very well known in Italy because his motorcycling world championships had been won on MV Agusta, the Italian team.
And let's just say, he was an absolutely brilliant rider.
He was a fantastic rider. He certainly was. And he was already known in Italy as Il Grande John, Big John. He wasn't particularly big, but his exploits certainly were. And he was already a figure when he got to Ferrari. So he wasn't some meek little person just kind of coming in. And because they'd been having a lot of problems with the car, he thought that he could help on the engineering side a bit. And their new young chief designer was a young guy called Mauro Forghieri, who was destined to become one of the legends of Ferrari. But then he was right at the beginning. And in Surtees' first season, he won one Grand Prix at the Nürburgring. And, the car was improving. And then for 1964, the car was very good indeed. And he won at the Nürburgring again and at Monza, which is the great race for Ferrari to win, of course, in front of the home support. And he won the title. Although, funnily enough, I'm sure you know this story, the last race of the season in America, the Ferraris weren't red.
Not NART.
NART, North American Racing Team.
Yeah.
Because Ferrari had one of his usual rows with organisers. And he said, I'm not sending a Scuderia Ferrari car. But his mate, Luigi Chinetti, who was his American representative, talked him into sending the cars as long as they were painted in the American colours of white and blue.
When I see that, because he ran number 7 in that race,
yep.
And I always think of Moss, because he probably would have run number 7 in a blue and white car
yep.
if he'd ever had a Rob Walker Ferrari.
That is true. How very poignant, I think that would be. Anyway, so Surtees won his title in a blue and white Ferrari. And that was a big thing. That was a little bit like Schumacher coming in decades later and reviving the team. Well, that happens at Ferrari from time to time. The driver can come in and galvanise, the team when it's on its
Schumacher, as you say, louder, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely right. Yeah. Yeah.
So, anyway, he did fall. He was a bit of a curmudgeon as well, wasn't he?
He was a difficult man.
Yeah.
And thereby...
when he had his own Formula One team, Surtees, the drivers used to find him tricky. Anyway, I interrupted. Carry on.
Yeah. No, it was. I think it was his way or no way quite a lot of the time. And thereby lay the seeds of his downfall at Ferrari. it's a complicated story, and Mike Parks, the English engineer,
and driver,
yeah, is thought to have played a part in it, because he wanted to take part in the development of the cars, and he butted heads with Surtees over that. But then Surtees started driving a Lola sports car. He'd sort of been given permission to do that, although Ferrari Formula One drivers usually drove Ferrari sports cars as well. But he'd been given permission to drive in American racing in a Lola. And it was sort of spread about the Ferrari works that this Lola had a lot of ideas which appeared to have been taken off the latest Ferrari sports car. And maybe maybe Surtees was playing a double game. I think that's a bit unlikely myself. I think, there's something also a bit naive about Surtees. But anyway, that's what happened. And then he had a really bad accident in America in a Lola and really hurt himself. So that put him out for a bit. And that, Ferrari never liked his drivers getting injured and being unavailable. That was not, didn't get them a tick in his book. But he came back, and then there was a row over, he was supposed to be racing at Le Mans, and there was a row over which car he was in, or indeed whether he was going to be in at all. And he had a row with Eugenio Dragoni, the team manager, and stormed out. And that was the end of his relationship with Ferrari, at which point Mike Parks stepped in.
And that was 66, wasn't it?
66.
And then I think the last race of the year, he went off and raced a Cooper in Mexico and won.
Yep.
And a fifth car, I think there were 4 or 5 Coopers in that race. Yep. And here's an anorak fact, as I like to sometimes call them. The 4th or the 5th Cooper was run by local driver Moises Solana. And they flew out a 19-year-old mechanic to work on that, young Mr. Ron Dennis. And the rest is colossally history.
And that's where he began, with Moises Solana.
He did. Who, by the way,
terrific.
Another anorak fact, is one of the few people later in a hill climb to die in a McLaren.
Really?
Though obviously Ron was not involved in that. Anyway.
There we are. I should say, actually, that Surtees' last Grand Prix for Ferrari was at Spa in 66. And it was a brilliant win in the race. It might have been his finest win in Formula One. So, there was no question of him going out because he wasn't good enough or anything.
And as I say, he went on and won in a Cooper.
Yeah, indeed. He was just a brilliant driver. I remember at the beginning of the 60s when he made the transition from motorbikes and he started in Formula Junior. And he was quick straight away, it was really obvious. And he was a throwback to people like Novellari, who'd begun on motorbikes and made the very easy transition for them to cars.
There were a few. Berra was another.
Yep, there were a few.
Obviously Halewood, but he was more bikes.
Yeah. And it's a bit surprising that there haven't been more in recent years. You might have expected Valentino Rossi to have ended up in a Ferrari.
He did a test or two.
He did. Johnny Cicotto came over from bikes to his brilliant bike
You
rider.
could say Damon Hill.
You could indeed. Let's say Damon Hill.
Let's say Damon Hill.
Indeed. A world champion who began on bikes. And that feels like a good time to say, and colossally, that's history. We'll be back next week with another in-depth discussion about a different topic. But in the meantime, if you're enjoying the show, and we very much hope that you are, please do follow or subscribe to the feed so you never miss an episode. Or even better, tell a friend about it if you think they'd enjoy it.
And if you want to get in touch with us or dispute our top 5 British Ferrari drivers, which entirely you're welcome to do, you can drop us a line on podcasts@the-race.com, or you can drop Richard or me a message on, well, they call it X, but let's call it Twitter. I'm at the Bish F1, and Richard is at rwilliams1947. Until next time, goodbye.
Goodbye.
And colossally, that's history.
The Athletic.